The UK and Iran face off in the Gulf as Britain deploys another warship to the region. How will Tehran react? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the tension between the UK and Iran. Britain's ships are on high alert in the Gulf, with the UK warning its vessels they're vulnerable to attack. Tehran accused the UK of piracy after it seized an Iranian tanker in Gibraltar. British officials suspect it was carrying oil bound for Syria in violation of EU sanctions. Tehran denied the allegations, and Iran's supreme leader hit back, promising retribution. How? By trying to seize one of Britain's own oil tankers. But they were forced to retreat when the Royal Navy's destroyers trained its weapons on them. UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has been trying to ease the tensions. But ever since the US pulled out of the historic nuclear deal, tempers have been short. And with Iranian claims that the UK is working at the behest of Washington, are they really the ones to try and cool things down? Melinda Nusifora has more.
The United Kingdom says it's adhering to international law. Iran calls it piracy. At the centre of their dispute is the Grace 1, an Iranian supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of oil. The UK says the cargo was being delivered to Syria. And at the start of the month, Royal Marines detained the ship and its crew off the coast of Gibraltar, a British territory.
We will not allow Gibraltar to be used or to be knowingly or unknowingly complicit in the breach of EU or other international sanctions, or for any of the matters which our laws prohibit.
Iran has denied it was sending crude to help Bashar al-Assad's regime. Instead, it says the oil was heading to what it calls a legal destination in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The British disagree.
در واقع این دزدی سال شکل قانونی معمولاً رفتارشون اینجوریست. جنایت رو میکنن، به جنایت خودشون میخوان یه قالب قانونی بدن، یه چیزی هم درست میکنن که آره علتش این بوده.
Iran is also currently embroiled in a tense standoff with the United States, and Tehran has accused the UK of doing America's bidding. British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt spoke directly to his Iranian counterpart to try and convince him otherwise. He said on Twitter, "I reassured him our concern was destination, not origin of the oil on Grace 1, and that UK would facilitate release if we received guarantees that it would not be going to Syria." For 2 weeks, top diplomats from both countries have been scrambling to defuse the situation. But it hasn't been smooth sailing. Britain says Iran is taking revenge by trying to block the passage of a British-flagged ship in the Gulf. A third Royal Navy warship is now on its way to the region.
We want to de-escalate a situation whilst at the same time being absolutely clear about our principles, that we uphold the rule of law. We will not allow oil to be sent to Syria, which is a regime that uses chemical weapons against its own people. And so what we're seeking to do is to resolve the situation in the context of our international commitments.
It's a stance Iran's supreme leader can't accept.
اما واقع قضیه همینه، دزدی دریایی است. دزدی دریایی هم که خب البته انشاءالله جمهوری اسلامی و عناصر مؤمن در جمهوری این کارها رو، این قباست‌ها رو بی جواب نمیگذارن. در فرصت خود و جای خود پاسخ خواهند.
Not a threat you want to hear from a country currently ramping up its uranium enrichment. Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now in Lancaster is Simon Mabon. He's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre and the director of the CEPAD project, which looks at sectarianism. In Lar, Iran, is politics lecturer Alim Saleh. He's a council member of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. And in Washington, D.C. is Matthew Brodsky, a senior research fellow at the Securities Studies Group. Good to have you all on the programme, gentlemen. Simon, the UK sending a third warship to the Gulf, but then saying, oh, no, this was pre-planned. It has nothing to do with Iran. Does anybody buy that?
That's a good question. I think what the UK is trying to do is cover all bases. It's trying to make sure that it contains its presence in the region, that it's got some military capabilities in order to support its own interests in the Gulf. But it also has to do it in a way that doesn't look like it's escalating the situation. It has to do it in a way that it doesn't come across that the UK is trying to increase its military presence as a means of deterring Iran. So it's trying to find whatever way it can to say, look, we are doing what we'd already planned to do, regardless of what had happened in the previous week. Now, the question is, does anyone buy it? I'm not convinced, to be honest, but that's part of the game that we're playing.
Alam Saleh, so the UK trying to flex its muscle, but wearing a heavy coat on top of it and doesn't want to show it. It's trying to do both. Why is it doing this right now?
I think there are two dimensions to explain United Kingdom's actions recently with Iranian tanker in Gibraltar. One is that in the post-Brexit era, London needs them more than ever. And that particular action came after a special request from Washington to drag London into the Middle Eastern games once again, like in 2003, when they have invaded Iraq. And this is particularly comes when Washington really is isolated in its war against Iran. Actually, it's the so-called maximum pressure, and it's in economic war actually, right, which has begun since 1 year.
Alam, can't it be just the fact that the UK is acting unilaterally here? That they're not Washington's lackey, and they're seeing the Iranians are seizing their tankers, they're seizing the Iranians' tankers, and they're acting on their own behalf without the hand of Washington behind them?
The United Kingdom is no longer an international actor or power. It cannot act by any means in the Middle East in particular, in the Persian Gulf region alone, but when it comes to support or to be supported by United States.
Okay, Matthew Brodsky, it's not the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt then that we should be looking to for answers when it comes to the spat with the Iranians. We should maybe be looking at the Americans, because the UK is an extension of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran right now. Is that how you see it?
I would say the Trump administration certainly hopes that that's the case. I mean, for a period now since May of last year, when the Trump administration partially withdrew from the agreement, a lot of time has been spent trying to get Europe on the same page as the administration so that there could be a negotiated new deal that's far more expansive, that deals with its nuclear program, its horrible behavior, and of course its ballistic missiles. But in the meantime, there's still a lot of infighting within our own coalition to be able to, of course, get together and put a united front forward to deal with Iran's increasingly aggressive behavior.
Matthew, the UK is seemingly throwing its lot in with Trump on this and not trying to be more like the other Europeans and saying, hey, maybe we can salvage the deal. Is it making the right choice?
I think so, because the nuclear agreement doesn't work. Iran is cheating now. That part is at least verified by the IAEA. But of course, it's been cheating previously, and we know that. Of course, the whole agreement was designed to allow cheating and to not have any method to push back other than international snapback sanctions. So we need to get to a new agreement. And the way to get there, of course, is to reclaim the leverage that the Obama administration squandered when it put together this deal. Now, in order to do that, so the whole point, I should say, is really to create this level of tension, which means, of course, Iran will lash out, but then to have a negotiation that will deal with the problems I just laid out. To fix the hull of a broken and sinking ship just doesn't make sense. And I'm sure the Trump administration is rather happy to have Britain on board with the U.S. We've always been really strong allies.
Okay, interesting that you used a ship metaphor here, because tensions revolve around ships that have been seized and oil tankers, right? Alam Saleh, Matthew believes that the UK is making the right decision by being firm with the Iranians. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with Matthew, and I would say I would rather consult the International Nuclear Agency, which has verified that Iran and the nuclear deal actually was working, and Iran was committed to the nuclear deal. Even the United Kingdom and London not only verified that the nuclear deal is working, but it's strongly supporting the nuclear deal. However, it's only Trump's personal decision and not even President Trump's administration. Many, or at least several big officials in Washington also disagree with Trump. So I think Trump, I totally agree with the former British ambassador to Washington that it's only Trump's personal decision, which he just only wants to defy what President Obama previously had done. So the nuclear deal was working and is working. And London and Europe and the whole international community supports the nuclear deal. It's only several individuals in Washington and in the region that agree with me.
Alam, the Iranians have hardly sat back and said, we're being treated badly here. They've also now exceeded the enrichment of uranium, the limit that was set under the deal. It's game theory on both sides, isn't it? The Iranians are also pushing sensitive buttons here.
Tehran has very few options open to them if these maximum pressures would continue. They also need some bargaining power, which at least persuade Europe to act more seriously in keeping this agreement, this internationally funded kind of verified agreement alive. Without strong and serious support of Europe and other international powers, this nuclear deal would definitely end with a disastrous consequence.
Simon, there is a power vacuum in the UK right now. There are unsettling moments politically in the corridors of power. With that in mind, is it in Britain's interest to have the spat with the Iranians?
I think what I must do, first of all, is say I agree with Alam about the power and the successes of the nuclear deal. And I must say that as well that I'm not convinced that the UK is fully behind Washington on this. This is more about the personalities. And I think there are a couple of personalities who've been incredibly outspoken in London about the negative aspects of the deal and wanting to support the United States. But others have been incredibly critical of President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal. The UK worked incredibly hard to get this nuclear deal off the ground. It worked incredibly hard to get all parties to come to the table and to thrash out a nuclear deal. And that was celebrated by many as a wonderful feat of diplomacy. So there was a great deal of consternation when it was announced that the United States would pull out. Now, I think what we're seeing in the UK is this political vacuum, this political uncertainty stemming from Brexit, stemming from concerns about the new Conservative Party leader and the new Prime Minister. There's a great deal of uncertainty as to what that new Prime Minister would do vis-a-vis Washington. Many, I think, suspect that Boris Johnson, if he was to win, would follow the United States in its policy towards Iran. But that would be to the chagrin of many others who see that diplomacy is actually the way out of international crises rather than unilateral action.
Yeah.
So it is a particularly worrying time right now.
Yeah, Simon, Boris Johnson, expected to be the new Prime Minister, he said that he would not support a war with Iran. He was quite clear and unequivocal on that.
Sure.
But when it comes to Boris, can we read much into that? Or will he switch it up as and when necessary, depending on circumstances?
I think it's very difficult to read anything into Boris. He says whatever he thinks is best for him at that particular moment, which means that there's a real contradictory set of views that he's presented, often in very close succession to one another. So while he said, yes, we will not support a war, I think he had to say that in the long run, if he thinks that it's in the best interest for him and perhaps for the country, then I would imagine that the UK would follow the United States. And that would have devastating consequences for the UK, for the United States, for Iran, for the region and for the world. We do not want a conflict, and diplomacy is the only way out of this, not unilateral action from the United States or from the UK.
Matthew Brodsky, as things stand right now, is anybody in Washington planning for an actual war with Iran?
I think the United States is always ready for every type of contingency. I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. released photos of its B-52s returning to the region. Those, of course, carry a far larger payload in terms of bombs to send a message to Iran. But, of course, that's not the preferred approach by any stretch of the imagination. And President Trump has shown fairly good restraint when it came to Iran shooting down one of our drones, an expensive drone, over international waters. He didn't follow a lot of advice and strike an attack. And that, of course is to get Europe again on the side of the United States to deal with reality as it is, which is we have a broken deal that does not work. In just 7 years' time, all the restrictions in the deal wear off, and Iran and the regime there, they're able to enrich uranium pretty much unrestricted. So by definition, the deal itself was not working and didn't address its behavior. So the restraint that Washington has shown is hopefully going to help bring more of our allies on board so we can address the issue, and that's what needs to happen. And in the meantime, we should expect but not accept that Iran is going to continue to lash out as it is. But they shouldn't mistake President Trump's ability to seek out the help of allies as a form of weakness. The U.S. will respond if it needs to militarily.
Alam Saleh, unpack something for me. After the incident in Gibraltar earlier in the month, we had Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, saying that this was piracy by evil Britain. He made sure to mention that Britain was evil. Unpack it for me. Is that just a bit of rhetoric, or should we read more into it?
I think that Tehran has showed that it's so pragmatic and it's so patient. Tehran knows it very well that the West, particularly United States, nor of course United Kingdom, is in a war mood. They are so reluctant to enter the war, any type of war against Iran. Iran is reaching the deterring power to somehow to deter United States from any kind of aggressive action against Iran. Iran knows it very well how to raise the tension, how to prolong this tension in order to put back pressure against United States and its regional allies. Ayatollah Khamenei is a very pragmatic politician in the end of the day. They know it very well, that they are so patient. They are also at the same time showing their strength by targeting an American drone, by somehow threatening American interests in the region. At the same time, they open the doors open to diplomacy.
Matthew Brodsky, in the same way that Bolton perhaps says a few crazy things about destroying the Iranians, but ultimately the system is more pragmatic. Do you accept that the Iranians are also rational actors in this and they're being pragmatic?
Well, look, Iran has made the decision that it will suffer the economic sanctions, and even though it wants relief. From its perspective, the whole game is about keeping the so-called right to enrich uranium on its soil. Now, that's something that the Trump administration recently began to toil with. Again, I said that we only partially withdrew from the agreement. So in May, we canceled 2 of 7 waivers that have to do with Iran's nuclear program. That is actually why there's been a recent spike from Iran's behavior. It's rational in terms of the #1 goal for the regime is to keep its nuclear weapons project going. It's not rational in terms of providing for its people, who of course continue to protest in the street, and it's willing to tank its entire economy in pursuit of nuclear weapons.
As we circle this back to the very beginning, Simon, looking at the UK and what they might be trying to do, we look at the situation with Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the UK still being unable to get her released from the Iranians. With that in mind, can the UK actually both project strength but still be diplomatic at this moment in time while it's in a period of political weakness?
It can, but it's incredibly difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult to balance that projection of strength when there are all of these domestic uncertainties and there's this domestic precariousness and there's a bunch of concerns about who the leader is going to be and their ideological positions, question about Brexit, questions about the impact of Brexit on British foreign policy, on British economic capabilities. And that sort of relates back to what Alam was saying about the reduced influence of Britain on the world stage. This isn't just a new position. This has been happening pretty much since the end of the Second World War. And a colleague and I wrote a book about the waning influence of Britain since that point. But yet Britain continues to hold a seat on the UN Security Council, and it continues to exert a great deal of influence internationally through its soft power. And it has these reserves that it can draw upon. Now, it's a case of balancing those reserves against the domestic uncertainty and the need to project strength vis-a-vis Iran, but also keep those lines of dialogue open in order to try and facilitate a diplomatic solution to this. And he's got to do that within the context of increasing pressure from the United States and demands from Europe to continue the diplomatic efforts to get a resolution to the Iranian question, whilst also trying to negotiate an exit from Europe. So it's a real complex balancing act. Now, one thing I should just say as well is that Iran is entitled to enrich uranium under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1967. It's a signatory. It is thus entitled to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. And that's something that I think is often overlooked in this debate. Now, of course, the JCPOA was designed to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's not entitled to do that. No, it's not entitled to enrich uranium to that level for a nuclear weapon. And that's where I think that's where the oversight and the JCPOA was actually working quite nicely. It was seen to be working, and there were international efforts to verify that and to say, look, this is working. And the Iranian leadership has repeatedly said, we do not want a nuclear weapon. And so it's difficult to balance that historical commitment, that historical treaty verified by the IAEA to allow Iran to have that peaceful nuclear enrichment, whilst also then simultaneously putting the pressure on from the JCPOA. So it's a difficult balancing act all round.
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on. But it's been good to talk to you all. Simon, Alam, and Matthew, talk to you soon. Bosco Ntaganda was one of the DRC's most notorious warlords, feared for his brutality and sexual violence, and infamous for raping, enslaving, and killing civilians. After years on the run, he handed himself in to the International Criminal Court in 2013. Now, 6 years later, the man they call the Terminator has finally faced justice. Judges at The Hague found the rebel leader guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, only the fourth person to be convicted by the ICC. But for many Congolese, justice has still not been served. Haider Abbasi explains.
Armed groups still terrorize the Democratic Republic of Congo, even though war officially ended here more than 15 years ago. Now, one of the men that played a major role in the conflict has been convicted by the International Criminal Court.
The chamber, having heard all of the evidence presented by the parties, finds you, as concerns count 1, guilty of murder as crime against humanity.
Bosco Ntaganda was found guilty of a total of 18 counts, including sexual slavery, rape, and the recruitment of child soldiers. All are considered war crimes and crimes against humanity. The court heard how Ntaganda once ordered the massacre of 49 men, women, and children. He's the fourth person to be convicted by the ICC, and all 4 have been from Africa. But Ntaganda's case is unusual. He surrendered to the US Embassy in Rwanda in 2013. Some reports said he turned himself in because he lost the leadership of a rebel group. Ntaganda was convicted for crimes in the Ituri region of the DRC. There's been fighting there since 1999 over gold mines and trading routes. But there's also been conflict between ethnic groups. Human Rights Watch says at least 60,000 people in the region have died since the fighting broke out. Ntaganda was born in neighbouring Rwanda. At 17, he joined a rebel group. Ntaganda is a Tutsi and fought to end the 1994 genocide under now Rwandan President Paul Kagame. After this, he fought in turns as either a rebel or a soldier in Rwanda and the DRC. Despite being indicted for war crimes in 2006, Ntaganda was allowed to join Congo's army and served as a general. But in 2012, he left the military and began a new rebellion against the DRC government. Ntaganda has only been convicted for the crimes he committed in Ituri. Critics say he should face further charges for suspected crimes in other regions. And like Ntaganda, many former warlords are now serving as military commanders or ministers. The ICC has been urged by rights groups to pursue these suspects too. So has the court been slow in trying to arrest and try war crime suspects? And would Ntaganda have ever faced justice if he hadn't surrendered? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's first go to The Hague, where we're joined by the ICC spokesman, Fadi Al-Abdallah. Good to have you back on the program, Fadi. Bosco Ntaganda, convicted of war crimes. Is this a victory for international justice?
I think it is an important day for a lot of different parties. It's an important day for the prosecution, of course. The prosecutors saw that the judges convicted Mr. Bosco Ntaganda for all the 18 charges for which he has been charged. It's also an important day for the victims, for sure, because they saw that after such a long period for the crimes, and after that, the long proceedings, there is a concrete outcome with the verdict itself. After that, we'll see there will be other hearings for the sentence and potentially for the reparations. I think it's also an important day for Mr. Ntaganda himself, because he can see the outcome of this first phase of the proceedings, which is the trial, and he can decide if he wishes to appeal this decision before the appeals chamber.
Right. 18 counts, including murder, rape, using child soldiers, and sex slavery. Now, he's the first to be convicted of that. Tell me how important that is.
I think that was one of the priorities of Madame Fatou Bensouda, the ICC prosecutor, is to fight in a strong way the sexual violence, gender-based violence, rape and sexual slavery. She has adopted very clear policies on the matter and continuously encouraged the investigators and her team of trial lawyers to continuously see where it is possible, of course, and when there is evidence on that, to include these charges in the cases. And we can start seeing the fruit of that with this conviction.
Right. And one of our panelists, who will be appearing in a couple of minutes' time, Vava Tampa, sent us a question that he wants you to answer, Fadi, because he's not fully convinced that we've seen justice been served here. And one of the questions that he asked was, will the ICC ever dare to go after President Kabila or Kagame, so that's DRC or Rwanda, or will they continue to target low-ranking commanders? And we've heard a lot of this, right? That perhaps as egregious as someone like Ntaganda's crimes were, the ICC can more easily go after small fry in the context of these horrible wars, not people who are behind much worse, or allegedly behind much worse. Address that for me very finely, please, Fadi.
Well, first, let's put the issue of Rwanda completely out of the scope of the ICC. Rwanda and the Rwanda genocide were dealt by another international tribunal. The ICC has no jurisdiction over what happened in Rwanda. So this is not a question before the ICC. For the other potential elements, I can say that the records of the court has shown and demonstrated that there has been either arrest warrants or summonses to appear before very high-ranking officials, whether for Mr. Gaddafi when he was the most powerful person in Libya, for Mr. al-Bashir in Sudan, for Mr. Kenyatta and Mr. Ruto, the president and deputy president of Kenya, and so on, and for Mr. Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was the vice president of the Congo, for Mr. Laurent Gbagbo, former president of Ivory Coast. The question is not whether there will be a possibility to investigate and even to charge them. Of course, that has to be built on evidence. For example, for Mr. Bemba, the trial chamber had convicted Mr. Bemba for the crimes for which he has been charged, but then the appeals chamber had decided that there was not sufficient evidence for that. It's a matter of how much you can have evidence in order to build cases for the persons who are allegedly the highest responsible for that. And for this, you need to put in place a lot of practice, a lot of experience, very strong policies, and to be able to build sometimes in a progressive way the capacities, the network, and the cases themselves in order to get to potentially high-ranking suspects that, as we are speaking, they always continue to remain presumed innocent unless and until there is a final decision, sometimes from the appeals chamber, that they are responsible.
Okay, joining us from The Hague. Good to talk to you once again, Fadi Al-Abdallah. Well, let's broaden out this discussion now. In London, I'm joined by Vava Tampa. He's an activist and founder of Save the Congo, a campaign group working for peace in the region. In Brussels is Philip Reinkens. He's a professor of law and politics at the University of Antwerp. And in Nairobi is Jean-Maubert Senga. He's Amnesty International's researcher for the DRC. Vava, let's jump straight into it. Are you satisfied with Fadi's answer?
No, not at all. Far from it. The question I had put to him, it had nothing to do with the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide happened in 1994. The ICC has no mandate to look into crimes that took place before 2002. The question I had put to him, and he had skillfully managed to run away from it, is that Mr. Kagame, evidence has shown, a UN report of the UN Security Council has shown, has been implicated in the ordering, in supporting, abating militia gangs and warlords in Congo, responsible for the killings of millions of Congolese and the displacement of millions more. Minister Ntaganda was one of those elements. He was a Rwandan national, a Rwandan officer in the Rwandan army who was killing, displacing, looting in Congo quite clearly on behalf of Mr. Kagame and Mr. Museveni, both President of Rwanda and President of Uganda. And Ntaganda was also connected with Mr. Kabila, who's the President of Congo, right, who was at least the President of Congo. So for him not to address that issue, the fact that Mr. Kagame has been supporting and abating these people, similarly Mr. Kabila and Museveni, it's really disappointing. It simply shows how weak the ICC is in actually supporting the victim. We should be able to go against anyone, regardless of their status. When someone abates war crimes, the ICC should be able to take a stand.
Philip Reinkens, the fact that Ntaganda over the years was a hired gun for the Rwandans, for the Congolese and others, he's an ethnic Tutsi, this is all entangled. The borders of nation states don't quite recognize some of these things sometimes. The fact that he was many things to many countries over the years, and the ICC also didn't really go after him, or he was even given a government role many years after his alleged crimes were well known and he was indicted for them. Does it take the shine off this conviction? Are there more questions than answers that come out of it?
Yes, I would definitely think so. And I agree with what Mr. Tampa said. The answer of Mr. El-Abdallah concerning the competence of the ICC for the 1994 genocide in Rwanda is obviously besides the point. Ntaganda was prosecuted in this case for crimes committed in the Congo, in Ituri, in 2002-2003. I should add that Ntaganda has been active, as his nickname suggests, Terminator, also in the North Kivu region back in 2008-2013. And it is quite striking that he's not just small fry, but he's also a loser. He gave himself up to the ICC through the US Embassy in Kigali because he feared he was going to be killed in an internal settling of scores in one of those multiple Congolese rebel movements, in that case the M23, which again was supported by Rwanda. So I agree with Mr. Tampa. It's fictitious justice in the sense that the weak guy and the small fry has been, and rightly so. I mean, Ntaganda is a war criminal. There's no doubt about that. But those who are responsible higher up, I mean, even the judgment that condemned Ntaganda now refers on several occasions to Rwandan support through ammunition, arms, even troops in Ituri in 2002, 2003. Although that is mentioned in the judgment, there is no consequence at all for someone like Kagame.
Jean Mobesenga, are we being too harsh here? We're saying this was a loser, he gave himself up, he was small fry in the context of the broader war, he didn't have as much blood on his hands as other people, this is victor's justice. Are we being too harsh? Should we be giving more credit to the fact that more than 2,000 victims participated in this process, and we've got a terrible person who's most likely to spend the rest of his life behind bars in The Hague?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I think the conviction of Bosco Ntaganda is still a good step and a positive step. If it's upheld in appeal by the court, it will definitely be a good thing for the victims of Ntaganda's heinous crimes in Ituri. But what Vava Tampa and Professor Regents have said is also true. The gap for justice in that region, and especially in DRC, is huge. And Ntaganda's conviction appears to be still like a drop of water in an ocean of impunity. And what is expected from the ICC, but not only the ICC, the wider international community, is to put in place a comprehensive justice strategy to address the widespread impunity in DRC that has been ongoing for over 25 years, and where, you know, above Ntaganda, there are people who must be held to account, and under him there are many others. But that cannot be the job of the ICC alone. It has to be a business of the entire international community.
Vava, as was mentioned, you know, he lived freely in Eastern Congo for about 7 years while he was wanted by the ICC. Diplomats, peacekeepers, the UN was there, everybody knew where he was. Even in your piece in The Guardian, you said you knew where he played tennis, right? But nobody nabbed him at that time. He was absorbed into the army long after many of his crimes were alleged and known. With all of that in mind, is it right when Jean Mobesenga says that this is just a drop of justice in an ocean of impunity?
Look, for those of us, and Jean Norbert is one of those people, him and I have fought in this fight for pushing for justice. So for those of us who had witnessed or spoken to people who had been victims of Bosco Ntaganda and other war criminals in Congo, it's an important day, and I recognize that fact, but I also recognize, we also recognize, all of us, as a community, as a country, that this is, as Norbert has said it, a drop in an ocean of impunity. Bosco Ntaganda, like Laurent Kunda, like other people, are small fish. And until we start going after the commanders, the enablers, people who gives them guns, people who gives them money, people who gives them armies to go and commit those crimes, nothing is going to stop. The ICC has been investigating the situation in Congo since 2003 or 4, and we have had about 4 or 5 convictions, but nonetheless, impunity continue, the killings continue, the rape, the exploitation, the illegality continues, and it continues because those people responsible for those crimes remain untouched. Amongst those people are President Kagame of Rwanda, President Museveni of Uganda, Joseph Kabila, who was the ex-president of Congo. Those are the key people that we need to target. And just to build on one thing, another issue.
I want to ask you something related to what's happening on the ground right now. Now, clearly, the situation is not as bad as it was in the 1990s, right, or the early 2000s. It's not as bad as that, but there's still a lot of trouble, especially in Eastern DRC. Can you see any positive impact on what's happening on the ground right now? With a verdict such as this one, can it have any tangible positive impact on the ground in trying to ensure peace and justice right now on the ground?
Look, I remain faithful. I remain hopeful and optimistic, not because of the international community per se or the ICC per se, because of the resilience of the Congolese people. We are a people that had lost over 5.4 million people in a space of 10 years. We are a people with 4 millions of our brothers and sisters displaced in the country. In spite of all of that, we continue to do amazing things. We continue to fight for justice. We refuse to give up. So I remain hopeful because of our people. However, in terms of the international community, and this is a broader issue here, because impunity is at the heart, peace begins with justice. Because impunity is at the heart of the situation in Congo, one of the elements which we now need the international community to embrace and put in place is the creation of either a special chamber or an international criminal court justice for Congo, so that everyone responsible for these crimes could be brought to justice.
Okay, and that's an interesting point, because then it's a complex web, because it involves other countries such as Uganda, Rwanda,
it does.
Burundi,
it does.
And so on, right? I have less than 2 minutes left. I want two final comments from Philip and Jean-Mabe Senga. So, Philip, very briefly, only 4 convictions since 2002, all African warlords of sorts since the ICC was created. Was it worth the effort, Philip?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, the world is a better place with an institution like the ICC than without it. And one must hope it will become more efficient than it currently is. And one must hope, of course, also, but there are many reasons that this is not happening, that suspects in other countries in the world will be indicted and convicted as well. So, yes, I think the ICC is worth proceeding with. It needs to improve. And it, at least in principle, it puts an end to impunity, although I share the views of my colleagues on this show that right now, in actual fact, this is not really what we expected it would become.
Jean-Mabe Senga, in less than 30 seconds, please, because I really have to wrap. I'm out of time. Wrap us up.
So as I said before, this is a good step, but this is not enough. And people of DRC are still waiting for further actions by the international community, including the ICC, to address the impunity epidemic in DRC. And until that is done, I think people will continue to express their discontent.
Vavatampa, Jean-Mabe Senga and Philip Reinkens, a pleasure to have you all on the program.
China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands.
The United States and China are two of the world's most powerful nations. Both have massive militaries with bases all over the world, and that includes in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. The two bases are only 15 minutes apart, and that proximity is proving to be a source of tension. Camp Lemonnier is used by the US for its counterterrorism operations in Africa. It claims Chinese soldiers have been trying to infiltrate its base. Their charges Beijing categorically denies, but that hasn't stopped the US from threatening to take action. So, with tensions mounting, where does that leave Djibouti, a nation caught between two superpowers? Well, to discuss this, let's bring in our panel. In Juba, we have Akol Nyok Akol Dok. He's a political commentator and an expert on China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And in Beijing is economic and political affairs commentator Einar Tangen. Good to have you both on the program. Akol Nyok Dok, is Djibouti caught between China and the United States here?
First of all, thank you for having me. Yes, I think Djibouti is caught because you have to realize that in 2017, from lease payments alone, Djibouti got 5% of its GDP from U.S., France, Japan, and China. And now Djibouti is crossroad because it owes debts to China, and the U.S. now is seeing the importance of its base. particularly in Africa. And this goes in line with also the port of Dueling, which John Bolton in that same speech talked about. And the U.S. has fears that the Chinese are looking to take ownership in that port due to the debts that Djibouti owes to China.
Okay, so Einar, Djibouti seems to be a prisoner of its own geography here. Horn of Africa, crucial strategic place, and the two most powerful countries in the world wanting a piece of it. Is that how you see it?
Well, I don't know how I see it. I think you should explore the facts first. What you have here is Djibouti, a very, very small country. They've managed to attract not only China and the U.S., but 5 other countries, including many European ones, the British, French, etc. So what it was is originally the U.S. came in. They had about, 80 acres. That's now expanded to 500 acres. The Chinese, they have about 4,000 troops there. The Chinese have about 1,000 troops and about 90 acres. Now, as invariably happens, young men who are in the military tend to be a bit competitive. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some hijinks going on. I know that the reports are very clearly that the U.S. is flying helicopters and also jets low over the Chinese camp, and they are responding by shining lasers at the crewmen and things like that. So these types of things go on. The issue here, though, is that you don't want it to kind of spiral out of control. And that's what's important.
Is it likely, Einar, that the Chinese did try to infiltrate the U.S. base?
I have no idea. I think it's pure speculation. You have the U.S. saying they did. You have China saying they didn't. If the U.S. had any sort of proof, I'm sure that they would put it up there. I mean, these perimeters that are patrolled, they're on CCTV, they're electrified fences, this type of thing. These are not somewhere where you just walk in the park. So if there was some sort of infiltration effect, they would have shown some sort of evidence to that duty. Now, earlier you said in your opening that China has many bases around the world. That's not true. U.S. does, about 400. But China actually, this is their one outside base. It was not created as a military base, but as a resupply station for the work that they've been doing on anti-piracy in Africa. So that was the ostensible mission. It's not clear exactly if that has changed. The U.S. side, as you correctly pointed out, this is a base for counterterrorism. They don't fly airplanes in there anymore because for some reason they thought it was unsafe.
Akol Diok, as we look at all the multiple interests here from the Chinese side and the American side, as was mentioned by Einar as well. So we have anti-piracy, we have anti-terrorism, we have just the strategic location, the fact that you have the Gulf of Aden, you have Yemen across the water, Somalia, and so on. And then there's also financial, right? There's Chinese investment in the country. Which is the highest priority for the government of Djibouti right now?
I think the highest priority for the government of Djibouti is its financial obligations to China. The government of Djibouti has debts to China, and the Chinese have invested heavily in the Djibouti, and that should be a priority for them. And I think this is the United States is trying to show that it's cognizant of what's happening in Africa. The policy, as John Bolton said, is to choose China or U.S. U.S. realizes the potential of China, Africa. The Chinese are very involved in Africa, as you see the China summit that they did in Beijing, where President Xi committed almost $60 billion to Africa. And now the U.S. might be worried about the Dorhe container terminal. And you see the U.S. commander, the AFRICOM commander, General Thomas Warlord, spoke to the Congress about the armed services about this issue. So I think the priority should be financial commitment. And additionally, Djibouti should consider that it's at a strategic place, and it might have to choose sides.
Right. And Akol, when it comes to financial commitment, there's a free trade zone. This was an agreement between the government of Djibouti and the Chinese. Is it for the benefit of Djibouti's government and its people, or is it going to find itself in a what people call debt trap?
Well, the issue with debt trap diplomacy is twofold. One is you can say there is irresponsibility of governments who commit themselves to these debts that they can't pay, but also the Chinese strategically realizing that they can't pay. It's threatening because the Chinese could, to recoup its debts and its money invested, seek to take part ownership or control of the Dorley container terminal, which is the feed that the United States has.
Aina Tangan, address the issue of debt trap diplomacy.
Quite frankly, China has been very interested in the economic development of Africa, and as you said, it's a very strategic area. They actually operate 2 ports in Djibouti, and they're looking like they'll be operating a 3rd. Now, the difference between the approaches between the U.S. and China is that the U.S. has been very active militarily. They've used it in the past to confront those they see as enemies, Russia, for example, in the past. But China has been putting money into Africa. They believe that there's strong trade there. Obviously, resources are very important to China. It's very low on the index of per person resources. And literally down around 100. So they need this. This is something they do. They're the largest importer of oil. The U.S. is not. So the real question, for many in China is why does the U.S. have 400 bases around the world in such a large concentration in this particular area? And then start complaining that the Chinese are expanding when in actuality they have a very, very minuscule footprint.
Okay, Einar and Akol, I've got to leave it at that. But I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, can $1 billion protect you from U.S. law enforcement? We'll debate the case of American financier Jeffrey Epstein. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.